Dr. Vega, thank you for being here this afternoon.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
I understand that you grew up in East Harlem. It was the time of the Palladium. It was the time of Celia Cruz. It was the time of Arsenio Rodriguez. It was the time of Hector Lavoe. Can you contrast that time in East Harlem when you grew up with what our young people are experiencing as they attempt to come of age and grow up in 2013?
Well, I think that every generation is different. You know, you can't expect what was to be, you know, because culture is a constantly changing thing. It's a constantly transforming thing, right? What the baseline, if we want to accept the baseline, is that what celebrates who you are, what celebrates tradition, what celebrates legacy, and also how does that legacy inform the future, right? So that today you have artists like Marc Anthony, right, whose voice is incredible when he sings, you know, to Puerto Rico. You have artists like El Canario, who's an incredible showman, you know. And you have, you know, vocalists like India, who grew up in the Bronx and now lives in Puerto Rico. You know, Ismael Miranda. You could go on with many artists that continue to influence and celebrate and teach through this song. And I think that the important thing of at least growing up in having an elder brother who was very much into music, so that music was very much part of my life, because my parents played Jibaro music from Puerto Rico. My brother played, you know, music of the Palladium, and then of course I was growing up with English music, you know. So that was the period of Elvis, that was the period of Fast Domino, that was the period of Little Richard, you know. So that you have all of this musical mix. I think critical is the narrative that these songs bring, you know, and are they empowering narratives? Do they speak about you, your people? Do they speak about, you know, your promise? So if anything, that's what, you know, one should be looking for in the music today.
When I think of the culture of adolescence as it exists in this school and as it exists in the environments where I interact with young people, I'm often distressed because I see young people labeling something that they consider other than themselves. For example, last week I had a young lady who thought that it was necessary to call one of her classmates an African booty scratcher. Mm-hmm. It turns out that there was an argument that had ensued because of a disagreement over a young man. But I find it troubling that even today we still think that it's okay to diss and disrespect each other. And I understand how we came to embrace that kind of mindset, having watched Tarzan movies and those kinds of negative stereotypes that were imbued as us as we came of age. But I wonder, what can we do to try and help these young people to see the error of their ways, and to try and get them to embrace the totality of their spirit and to embrace the diaspora? What would you say to
I think that you have to deal with the language of now and the technology of now and what's available now. I mean, growing up, I didn't have an iPhone. You know, growing up, I didn't have the internet. Growing up, you know, all of these inventions are recent, you know. And I think that we have to use that technology to inform. We have to use the ability to create your own narrative to inform. I mean, it's very much what you're doing, publishing the works of young people that are positive, celebrating the work of young people that are positive. And I think that there are opportunities now that didn't exist before to connect globally with others doing this work. And I feel, you know, and I hate making black statements, is that many of us think that the past was better. And it wasn't necessarily better. You know, my brother had no problem saying like I look like an African, you know, and meaning derogatory, you know, when my hair would stand up because I came from the beach, or it was, you know, humid, or my mother, you know, braiding my hair so it wouldn't stand up. And it carried the same message, you know, that your hair is not good, you know, that your hair isn't pretty. And I think that what we have to do is use what's available now to carry the messages that we want our children to have. Calling each other names, you know, from nigga meaning pretty, I love you, to, you know, if it happens in a certain, if it's made in a certain tone, and others using it if it's made in another term, you know, it's contentious. People have to understand, you know, young people have to understand the history of the term. You know, you still want to use it. Can you transform that term? And I think that we have to have more exchanges, almost like we did today, in the smaller ways, you know, so that young people understand a historical context as well as how it impacts now. But, you know, the past is the past. It serves us as lessons, but we can't live in the past.
Well, you know, when I read In the Spirit's Dance, I remember an episode where you had gone to your grandmother to tell her that there was a young man, I think his name was Ronaldo, who had an interest in you, mm-hmm. and that interest was reciprocal. Mm-hmm. And if memory serves me correctly, when you walked into her room and proceeded to tell her who this young man, or to talk about this young man, she said to you, well, you know, don't lie to me. Because she could discern what you wanted to say and what your spirit was about. But what struck me, one of the things that struck me about that narrative is your grandmother proceeded to sit and channel, if you will, this African spirit. I think his name was Wango, if memory serves me correctly. And he says quite clearly that I'm a African slave. Those kinds of references that I think are pervasive in Puerto Rican folklore and the folklore of the diaspora. Mm-hmm. Nonetheless, with those African deities, we still have sometimes a habit of disrespecting each other in the manner that we've just talked about. Right. Why do you think that occurs?
Because the narrative that has existed and is publicized is a narrative that comes from outside our community that doesn't understand it. I think that most of the people, anthropologists, right? And what is anthropology? But looking at the other, have come from the outside looking in. And that's why, you know, I'm not a writer, and I'm clear I'm not a writer, but I wrote it because I know that a lot of the young people that were in this room today are going through the same thing with their grandparents and their parents. I mean, when I mentioned spirit, young people understood it. How often is that conversation brought into the classroom as a valid conversation?
Just parenthetically, I remember as a kid growing up in Georgia, growing up in the Baptist church, and I've seen my mother possessed, and she would speak in tongues. And I couldn't understand it, but as I look at what I've observed in places like Brazil or the Pentecostal church, similar. And it's the same thing. Having said that, I look at, I mentioned earlier, having a Puerto Rican Supreme Court Justice and a Barack Obama. I look at those kinds of advances and still think that this perhaps is not a post-racial America. Would you agree with that? And
no, I agree with that. I think that, you know, systematic racism still exists. The closing down of the government for 2 weeks, what was that about? If it wasn't about Obama, right, as president, but also as a black man, about power, right, about people who want to be in power and have others marginalized, So it has many levels, and there is systemic racism. It's embedded in the law. What was stop and frisk, right? One of my godchildren, Floyd, was one of the claimants in the case. It's named after him. Why? Because he was in front of my house, because he lived in one of my apartments. He's in Cuba now, and was trying to get into his house, and the police stopped him. And he says, "I live here," and stop and frisk in front of his own apartment, right? So that he didn't have a chance to speak. Really, it was just sort of this confrontational meeting that led to this case, right? So that you still have that. You still have our schools under-resourced in certain areas that represent Latino and African and young people of color. So that there's a lot of work that still has to be done. That there has been levels of progress, absolutely. You know what I'm saying? But does there need to be more? Absolutely. Do we need to continue being vigilant? Absolutely. Do we continue building schools of our own, after schools of our own, institutions of our own? Absolutely. Because that's the voice of our scholars, that's the voice of our researchers, that's the voice of our professors and teachers. You mentioned Wadleigh Sanford. I mean, Wadleigh Sanford is an incredible, intelligent woman. You know what I mean? She should be superintendent of schools. You know what I'm saying? Because of her vision, her understanding, her educational achievements. Will she be? Can she be? Probably not, because she brings a perspective that is a perspective that's inclusive, that is grounded and in the culture of our community and the successes of our community. The system now, the educational school system now, is grounded in the culture and in the successes of Europe. You know what I'm saying? So that it's a different narrative. That's why I brought up the point of minority, because as long as our young people consider themselves less than, they will act upon being less than. As long as our adults feel less than, they will act upon it being less than. And as long as our adults, our educators, continue to feel that other is success, right? They will always belittle their own experience, trying to fit into what they consider is success, right? Which is the other, that European sort of matrix. And there's no denying, if you leave your traditions behind, you're probably apt to be more successful than not. That's the reality. So that if you have that choice, then you say, well, would I rather be up here making a lot of money even though it disrespects me, or would I rather be over here making less money, right, and feeling whole? What depends, that's a risk you take, that's a commitment you make, that's when you decide who you are.
Where do you get that courage? Where does it come from? Because fundamentally, that's what we've been trying to say to these young people, that you need to find the courage to embrace yourself. But where does Dr. Vega get
My parents. My dad. I mean, my dad would quit a job because he was disrespected. You know what I mean? Because he was a black man, Puerto Rican, and at that time, not speaking English, people didn't understand you not speaking English, right? They didn't know where you were from. And that was before the influx of the 50s of Puerto Ricans coming to New York. And he had a very difficult time because he was a carpenter. And no one would allow him, the factories wouldn't allow him to work machines. And my father said, being a janitor is a wonderful thing if you want to be a janitor, but I don't want to be a janitor, I'm a carpenter, I want to be a carpenter. And I want to work with my hands. So he changed his career and became an auto mechanic because he felt that he had a right to do what he wanted to do. And my mother was the same thing. She always said, you can be whatever you want. Nobody can tell you no. And that's what I grew up with. Like, sometimes something would happen, let's say in school, and the teacher said no. She said, no, it's not acceptable. No doesn't kill. Go back and talk to her. Or she would go with me and talk. You know what I'm saying? But for her, certain things were just not acceptable. And with my sons, the same thing. Certain things were not acceptable. I was more in school than they were. Sometimes they laugh because they were like, you were in school like before we got into school, because there were certain things that they would say, you know, at the kitchen table or just talking to each other, and I would hear it, and they would not necessarily share it with me, and I would be in school questioning the teacher, you know, because my mother was very clear. The school's supposed to teach you. The teacher's not supposed to love you. I love you. You know, my mother said, I love you. The teacher is supposed to respect you and teach you. That's her job, or his job. You know what I mean? At home, you're supposed to get love, and we love you. You know, and that was throughout my career. That was the reality.
I don't know if this is an appropriate question, and I know you have to go, so I'll bring this full circle. But oftentimes, I meet young people who don't have the kind of environment out of which you came. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes they confess to me some of the issues that exist in their households. And I'm at a loss as to what I can say to them, you know. In fact, there was a young lady I think she was from Guatemala. She came here last year and was really very withdrawn. But after coming to the library for a while, we gradually developed, you know, a kind of a relationship. And she let me know that there were some things in her household that were not very good at all. And I agonized because there was nothing that I could really say to her other than to try and support her when she came. So oftentimes I find those negative behaviors being the consequence of the environment out of which they come, and I don't really know what I can do or say.
Well, I think you're exceptional, you know, and I think when I was teaching, I was exceptional, and you have exceptional teachers, there's no question. You know what I mean? That care and really look at helping young people. But you know, we're talking in around generalities as to what's available to our young. Yeah, there are conditions that are unacceptable, and we have to tell young people those conditions are unacceptable. You know, and we understand they're unacceptable. And is there an aunt or an uncle that you might go to? If there's nobody, you know, is there a friend? You know, I think that that's within the parameters of an educator or someone who's dealing, you know, or provide referrals to the young person to go to. And I think that that's important to know that there are services that young people should go to, or people that they should talk to. You know, I mean, sometimes teachers refer young people to me to speak to, or I'll refer an intern that may come into the center to do an internship, and we see that that child is withdrawn or doesn't feel right, or the energy doesn't feel right, so we'll sit and talk to them, you know what I mean, and then circle back to the teacher and talk to them. You know, trying to put them in an environment, or, you know, the person in an environment that you see like, this is not the way it's supposed to be. You know, it's unfortunate that it is, that you're here, but how can you make this different? And if you can't make this different immediately, how can you work to get out of that situation? You know, that's the best that we can do, you know, because we see it. You know, some of our adults are broken. They're broken. You know what I mean? And we can do the best that we can do.
I understand that you can't provide all of the answers that I'm seeking, and that's, I'm not laying that burden at your at your feet.
Nobody can.
But if I can get a little personal, one of the reasons why I've always sought you out, for want of a better way to say it, is because of your example, how I how I perceived you, how I felt when I heard you, how I felt when I saw you. And this is not about me, but I just have to say that when I finally arrived in the wilderness of New York from Georgia, one of the people I wanted to try and sit across and to meet was Dr. Vega. And when I talk to people like Dr. Sanford, or talk to colleagues of mine, there's a unanimity of praise because they were affected in much the same way that I was affected. I wish I could somehow, bottle that and distribute it. I said all that to say, I really appreciate the fact that you've allowed me to sit here and talk with you. I appreciate the fact that you've again come to the village of this moment. And I have to say in all candor, speaking to you, there's a little bit of nervousness, and I'm trying to reconcile that in my spirit. And I've just decided that I've got to embrace that and just let it be what it is. But again, I know that you have to leave. I'm hoping that any young person that has the opportunity to see this will take courage and will be able to embrace the essence of who and what you are, and somehow be encouraged and inspired to make something of their lives. So in conclusion, I'd like to know if there's anything you'd like to say to any young person that may see this.
I think that, we're always looking for salvation outside. And I don't think you find salvation outside. You find guidance. You find role models, maybe. So-and-so did it this way, so-and-so did it this way, so-and-so did it that way, right? You mentioned Sotomayor, she came out of the projects 3 blocks away from where I live, Wadleigh Sanford, she's a model, there are so many models. But everybody has their own road and their own path. And as mentors, as educators, as aunties, uncles, parents, what you could just do, and I'm not just saying just as belittling, but what we can do is say, well, this is my way. This was so-and-so's way. But you have to find your own way. I can't give you power. You give you power.
Right.
That's why my mom used to, and like now in retrospect, I understand what she was doing. She was like, no, don't tell me so-and-so did. Tell me what you did. And tell me why you did that. And I had to answer for me. Not for the group, I had to answer for me and take responsibility for me. And how do you come by that? You come by that by being around people who think that way, who act that way. How do we do it for our young people? By putting them in situations where they can see people who control. You know what I mean? And we love having interns at the center. Because you can see, even in a month, how young people change, because they see me as the boss. They see everyone who works at the center is of color. Either from St. Kitts, either from Antigua, or from the South, or from New York, And we're all from different places with different talents. So when they're there, they're like, okay, you got to do this. You know what I mean? Or you're partnering on this. What's your interest? And some, young person, well, I'm interested in finding out about Black colleges. Okay, research it. And, provide the list to the education department so we can send publicity material or promotion material, so we connect it to the work that we're doing. So that you have a responsibility to be part of the group as well as get information that's important to you, And they a part of the group that's working. And in a month, you could see the change. In less than a month, you can see the change. Because all of a sudden, you know, they're seeing themselves. They're seeing their mama, their auntie, their brother, their aunt, uncle, you know, somebody that looks like them functioning in a way that's empowering and healthy.
If I can just thank you with the words of, I think it was Owen Dotson. He said, nothing happens only once. Nothing happens only here. Every love that lies asleep wakes today another year. Why we sailed and how we prosper will be lived and sung again. All the lands repeat themselves, shore for shore, and men for men, and women for women. Dr. Vega, again, I'm humbled and deeply appreciative of this sacred moment, and thank you for allowing me to sit across from you today.
Thank you for inviting me. Okay. Thank you.